The city stands frozen in time. Empty apartment buildings reach toward the sky. Rusted bumper cars sit silent in an amusement park that never opened. A Ferris wheel turns no more. The streets are overgrown with trees and vines. Nature has reclaimed what was once a thriving Soviet city. This is Pripyat, the ghost town of Chernobyl, a city where 49,000 people lived and laughed and dreamed. A city evacuated in a single afternoon. A city that will remain abandoned for thousands of years to come. Close your eyes. Let us walk through empty streets. Let us remember what was lost on April 26, 1986. Pripyat was born in 1970, created to house the workers of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was built with pride, with optimism, with the belief that nuclear power represented humanity's bright future. The Soviets called it the peaceful atom. Nuclear energy would light the world without pollution, without the smoke and ash of coal. It was clean. It was modern. It was progress. The city was designed as an atom grad, an atom city, one of 9 such closed cities built across the Soviet Union to support nuclear facilities. But Pripyat was meant to be a showcase, a demonstration of Soviet achievement, proof that nuclear technology could coexist peacefully with human life. And for 16 years, it did. Pripyat grew quickly. Young people came from across the Soviet Union, drawn by good jobs, modern amenities, and the promise of a better life. The city had everything a Soviet citizen could want: new apartment blocks, a hospital, schools, a cultural center called the Palace of Culture. There was a sports complex with a swimming pool. There were shops and restaurants. There were parks and playgrounds. The average age in Pripyat was just 26 years old. It was a city of young families, of children, of people building their futures. There were weddings and births and celebrations. Life was good here. Life was normal. The Chernobyl nuclear power plant stood just 3 kilometers from the city. 4 reactors were operational by 1986, with 2 more under construction. The plant was a source of pride. It generated electricity for millions of people. It was safe, they said. It was modern. It was the future. On the night of April 25, 1986, the operators at Chernobyl prepared for a safety test. The test was routine, designed to determine whether the reactor's turbines could provide enough electricity to keep coolant pumps running during a brief power failure. It was a sensible test, but the timing was unfortunate, and the execution was flawed. Reactor number 4 was scheduled for routine maintenance. The reactor's power was reduced. The emergency cooling system was disabled to prevent it from interfering with the test. Delays occurred. The test was postponed. By the time operators received permission to proceed, the less experienced night shift had taken over. They had not been properly briefed on the test procedures. What happened next was a cascade of errors, compounded by fundamental flaws in the reactor's design. The operators removed too many control rods. The reactor became unstable. When they attempted to shut it down, a design flaw caused the opposite reaction. The power surged. In seconds, the reactor went from 7% power to more than 100 times its normal operating level. At 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, Reactor number 4 exploded. The explosion blew the 1,000-ton reactor lid off. The reactor core was exposed to the open air. A second explosion followed. The building was destroyed. Radioactive material, more than would be released by 100 Hiroshima bombs, was thrown into the atmosphere. A plume of radiation rose into the night sky, glowing blue and red from the burning graphite in the reactor core. The fire would burn for 10 days, sending radioactive particles high into the atmosphere, where winds would carry them across Ukraine, across Belarus, across Russia, across Europe. The invisible poison spread far and wide. But in Pripyat, 3 kilometers away, the people slept. They were not told what had happened. They were not warned. They were not evacuated. 2 plant workers died instantly in the explosion. 28 more would die in the coming weeks from acute radiation syndrome. The firefighters who responded to the blaze did not know they were walking into lethal radiation. They wore no protective gear beyond their normal firefighting equipment. They were heroes. They were also doomed. In Pripyat, people woke on the morning of April 26th to a normal Saturday. Children went out to play. People went to shops. Some noticed a strange metallic taste in their mouths. Some felt nauseous. Some saw the strange glow on the horizon. But there were no sirens, no announcements, no warnings. The Soviet system prized secrecy above transparency. Officials deliberated. They hesitated. They did not want to cause panic. They did not want to admit that their safe, modern, peaceful atom had failed so catastrophically. For 36 hours, the people of Pripyat went about their lives, unknowingly exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Children played in contaminated dust. People breathed contaminated air. Every moment they remained increased their exposure. Finally, on the afternoon of April 27th, the decision was made. Pripyat would be evacuated. Over 1,000 buses arrived, lining up at apartment blocks throughout the city. Police and officials went door to door with a prepared announcement. They told the residents that due to the accident at the power plant, it was a temporary evacuation, a precautionary measure. They said residents should take their documents, some personal belongings, and food for a few days. They said they would return soon. It was a lie. The evacuation began at 2 in the afternoon. It took 3 hours. 49,000 people were loaded onto buses and driven away from their homes, away from their lives, away from everything they knew. They left behind their furniture, their photographs, their pets, their memories. They thought they would return in a few days. They never did. The buses drove south to Kiev, where residents were dispersed to towns and villages across Ukraine. Some families were separated. Some never found each other again. The city they left behind would become a forbidden zone, a place too contaminated for human habitation. The cleanup began. It would eventually involve over 500,000 workers, called liquidators. They came from all over the Soviet Union. Their task was impossible, but they tried anyway. They built the sarcophagus, a massive structure of steel and concrete to entomb the destroyed reactor. They worked in shifts of only a few minutes at a time, the radiation levels too high for longer exposure. They cleared radioactive debris from the roof using robots at first, but when the robots failed in the intense radiation, they sent in men with shovels. Each man worked for 40 seconds, then ran back inside, having absorbed his lifetime maximum dose of radiation in less than a minute. They buried the contaminated soil. They cut down the contaminated forest and buried the trees. The work was heroic. The work was tragic. Many of the liquidators would later develop cancers and other radiation-related illnesses. Back in Pripyat, the city stood empty. The evacuation had been so sudden that the city looked as if people might return at any moment. Dishes sat on tables. Books lay open. Clothes hung in closets. Children's toys were scattered on floors. The city had become a snapshot of Soviet life in 1986, frozen in time. But slowly, the city began to decay. Without people to maintain it, nature began to reclaim Pripyat. Trees grew up through the pavement. Vines climbed the walls. Rain and snow leaked through roofs. The city that had been so new, so modern, began to crumble. The amusement park became one of the most haunting symbols of the disaster. It had been scheduled to open on May 1st, just 5 days after the explosion. The Ferris wheel had been tested, but never carried passengers. The bumper cars had never been driven. Now they sat rusting, a monument to interrupted lives, to celebrations that never happened, to the future that was stolen. An exclusion zone was established, a 30-kilometer radius around the power plant. No one was allowed to live there. Some elderly people were eventually allowed to return to villages on the edge of the zone. They are called the Samosli, the self-settlers. They preferred to spend their final years in their ancestral homes, radiation or no radiation, rather than die in unfamiliar places. The Chernobyl plant itself continued to operate. Reactors 1, 2, and 3 were restarted in the months after the disaster. Workers needed jobs. Ukraine needed electricity. Finally, in December 2000, the last reactor was shut down. The plant was officially decommissioned. But the contamination remains. The isotopes released in the explosion have half-lives measured in years, decades, centuries. The exclusion zone will be dangerous for longer than human civilization has existed. In the decades since, Pripyat has become a place of fascination. Scientists study it. Photographers document it. Tourists take guided tours through the ghost town. They walk through abandoned schools. They visit the hospital. They see the swimming pool. They photograph the Ferris wheel, the cultural center, the apartment buildings with trees growing from their balconies. Nature has thrived in the absence of humans. Wolves roam the empty streets. Deer graze in abandoned yards. Wild horses run through the forest. Bears have been spotted. Birds nest in the empty buildings. The ecosystem has recovered in unexpected ways. The absence of humans, it turns out, is more beneficial to wildlife than the presence of radiation is harmful. In 2016, a new safe confinement structure was completed. Built on rails, it was slid over the original sarcophagus. The new structure is enormous, designed to last 100 years. It is an engineering marvel. but it is also a monument to hubris, a reminder of what happens when safety is sacrificed for speed, when warnings are ignored. The disaster shattered the Soviet Union's credibility. The government's attempts to cover up the accident eroded public trust. When Mikhail Gorbachev later reflected on the collapse of the Soviet Union, he said that Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause. The disaster exposed the weaknesses of the Soviet system. It also changed how the world views nuclear power. The accident sparked intense debate about the safety of nuclear energy. Some countries abandoned nuclear programs. Others strengthened safety regulations. Today, Pripyat stands as a warning, a memorial, a ghost town that reminds us of the price of mistakes, the dangers of overconfidence, the thin line between technological triumph and disaster. The empty buildings slowly crumble, the rusted Ferris wheel sways slightly in the wind, but never turns. The bumper cars corrode, the schools decay. Time and weather and radiation work together to erase what humans built. But the memory remains. The stories remain. The lessons remain. Pripyat, the city that was evacuated in 3 hours and will remain abandoned for thousands of years. The city where 49,000 people lived normal lives until one night in April, when the atom, the peaceful atom, showed its terrible power. Tonight, we remember Pripyat. We remember the firefighters who rushed toward danger. We remember the liquidators who sacrificed their health. We remember the families torn from their homes. We remember the children who played in contaminated dust. We remember the future that was stolen. Let us rest now, here in the quiet of memory, where the past lingers like radiation, invisible but present, fading slowly but never quite disappearing. Sleep well.